We're starting off the conference with a special panel. The session is generously supported by the Real Estate Foundation of British Columbia. Now, as we begin the summit, we invite you to consider and think about your role as a practitioner, organization, and as a sector on a whole in advancing the United Nations declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, otherwise known as UNDRIP. So to speak of the benefits of indigenizing planning and decolonizing land use is our opening panel, and it's my pleasure to invite Tara Marsden, Jessie Hemphill, and Ginger Gosnell-Myers to the stage.
As they're making their way to the stage, I would love to introduce the moderator for our opening panel. Pleased to introduce Tara Marsden from the Naxginkw clan of Gosnell-Myers of the Gitxsan peoples. For more than 2 decades, Tara has been dedicated to advancing sustainable development and operationalizing free, prior, and informed consent for Indigenous peoples. Tara has worked for a number of First Nations governments, academia, the provincial government, philanthropic organizations, and for her own nation, Gitxsan, as WILP Sustainability Director. In 2021, Tara established Hlimoo Sustainable Solutions to continue her life's work as an independent consultant in her homelands of the Gitxsan people. Tara is currently the UNDRIP Fellow at the Real Estate Foundation of BC. She's kind of a big deal, so let's give a big round of applause for Tara. Take it away, Tara.
Thank you so much, Haichka Doiksitnism. I think the only thing comparable to listening to your own bio read is when you're sitting there and everyone's singing happy birthday to you and you don't really know where to go look or what to do. Thank you so much for the wonderful welcoming from Snuneymuxw First Nation, from the school, and as guests in this land, and we are in a land summit, and we are all reflecting on our relationship to land and what that means to us. As in our protocol for the Gitxsan people, we have to do our homework when we're visitors. We have to understand whose land am I going to and what are their teachings. And so I did a bit of research, and I'll share with you what I learned about Snuneymuxw teachings around laws, spiritual guidance, and the worldview that sees the interconnected relationship between all living things in creation and things that must be all equally respected. And so that this is not merely a commodity. Land is not a commodity. It is something that we are in relationship with constantly. I'd like to thank our conference host organizers and the panel sponsor, the Real Estate Foundation, for their groundbreaking work in advancing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Our purpose is to come together in collaboration and to share our knowledge and to share our best practices and some of the challenges that we're all facing in doing this work. I'm really honored and excited to introduce our panelists. I don't get to talk as much, which is great. I will be speaking tomorrow on UNDRIP as well if you want a deeper dive and spend a little more time with it. But we're going to be talking about Indigenous planning and UNDRIP. So just to give you a bit of a sense of our format, I'll introduce our panelists. They will get to also introduce themselves in their own language and protocol as they wish. We'll first hear from Jessie and then Ginger. And then I'll hopefully have time for a question or two to them, and they can also dialogue with one another with a question or a comment or a reflection, and then we'll open up the floor. I believe we have some mic runners at the end, and we will aim to not take us too far past 5:30, which is what we're aiming for. So first, I'm honored to introduce Jessie Hemphill. You have her bio, but Jessie is a planner, an educator, a facilitator, entrepreneur, and former elected municipal councillor. Among her many achievements, she's a recipient of the Canadian Institute of Planners President's Award for Young Planners. And Ginger is equally incredible in her achievements in the decolonization of city planning, including being the first Indigenous Relations Manager for the City of Vancouver, the first Indigenous Fellow for the Simon Fraser University Morris J. Wosk Center for Dialogue, and has contributed to the City of Vancouver's Climate Justice Charter. Jessie, please join me at the podium.
Great. Gelakisla. Nugu tlali logula, Kayakin la Nakutau, Tlu Liquitau, Tlu Meti, Yukwalin la Snuneymuxw, Gelakisla Snuneymuxw, Gela kisla lali dlu Colleen dlu gingananam. Gela kisla local atle. Thank you so much for the nice introduction, Tara. And I'm so stoked to be on a panel with Ginger, like total fangirl. It's such an honor to be with you this evening. I've just introduced myself in my own language and let you know that my name is Tlali Logola, or Bridge Between the Worlds, leader of the Killer Whale Pod, as another way of describing it. Let you know I'm from the Naquadal and Liquitlauch peoples of the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation on my mother's side, and Métis from the Red River Valley on my father's side. I have the privilege of living here in Snuneymuxw territory. We also have family ties to Snuneymuxw, and it's such a pleasure to be in these territories with you all. I'm an honored guest here to do the keynote for the Land Summit. I'm really excited that the theme is collaboration and connections, because I think it works so well with what we're going to be talking about. And when I was thinking about my goal for my brief keynote this afternoon, I felt like I really wanted to inspire everyone in this room, many of you familiar faces who I know could use a little bit of inspiration, to think about how we can all more deeply connect and collaborate with Indigenous peoples specifically. And to do so, I want to focus on a passion area of mine, which is Indigenous planning and land management wisdom, specifically from pre-contact times. I think these are stories that we don't often hear, and if you've been trained into planning or lands management, it's very likely that your training omitted the entire history of pre-European contact Indigenous peoples, rich with planning and land management wisdom. So I aim to rectify that this afternoon with kind of an amuse-bouche of Indigenous brilliance in 10 minutes or so, meant to inspire and spark a desire to connect and collaborate with Indigenous folks. It is easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of current and ongoing crises, global pandemics, geopolitical instability, climate change, growing wealth inequality. But the fact is that Indigenous folks have been through all of those things and more. We have survived the apocalypse, and we are still here to share our own lessons learned, the three of us and many of you in the crowd being a testament to that. So, I hope you enjoy. Like I say, this amuse-bouche will cover a lot of ground quite quickly before I hand the mic over to my esteemed colleague. So buckle in for the next 10 minutes, starting with two quick examples of transportation planning and infrastructure. Can I see a show of hands? Oh, I'm going to skip. Yeah, a show of hands in the room, anyone who works in transportation planning or infrastructure. Is there any folks in the room who deal with like roads and bridges and stuff? Okay, I hope this is super cool for you, and maybe you don't know about it. The first example I'm going to share is the Incan Road Network, which was built and maintained in large part through a sophisticated taxation system. It was the most extensive and advanced transportation system in pre-Columbian South America. This road network, like first of all, have you ever even heard of the Incan Road Network as an example of transportation planning or infrastructure planning? And yet this road network, I want you to make a guess for how long you think it might have been. It's the longest road network in pre-Columbian South America. Would you be surprised to hear that it was 40,000 kilometers long? And by comparison, the Trans-Canada Highway is 7,281 kilometers long. So 5 times longer than the Trans-Canada Highway from pre-Columbian South America, maintained by a sophisticated network of government policy, taxation, and collective goodwill. Amazing. The second example I want to share, this beautiful picture, you can't see it super great. It's from a great book called Low Tech, TEK, Traditional Ecological Knowledge, is an example of the living root bridges, which were created by the Khasi and Jaintia folks, Indigenous folks from India. So we're doing a bit of a global tour this afternoon, although we'll settle into some local examples towards the end. These living root bridges, again, an example of transportation infrastructure, took 15 years to build out of the aerial roots from rubber trees and could last for centuries, only strengthening and improving as time went on, contributing to the local ecosystem and allowing for the free flow of people and goods throughout these areas of these Indigenous peoples. Just imagine for a moment, as we're grappling with challenges around environmental sustainability in all areas of land management and planning, how different our transportation networks would be if we could build them in a way that only strengthened over time, contributed to local ecosystems, and turned into dirt when we were done with them. Next, we're going to look at an example of urban planning. I want to share this next example specifically to counter the narrative that all Indigenous peoples were nomadic hunter-gatherers and to show that, in fact, urbanism has deep, deep roots in indigeneity. I'm going to skip this example because we won't have time and jump right to Tenochtitlan, which is an Aztec city. It was the capital of the Aztec Empire in the 15th century. So before I get into this one, can you raise your hand in the room if you are someone who works in urban planning, urban design, urban environments? So a ton of us. And I wonder how many of you have heard of this city as an example of urban design, incredible urban planning, again, from pre-contact South America, or pardon me, from the Aztec Empire. So this is the capital in the 15th century with a population between 200 and 4,000 people. By comparison, the Capital Regional District has a population of 383,000. So we're talking about comparable numbers to the Capital Regional District. In Europe at that time, only Paris, Venice, and Constantinople were comparable cities in size in the 15th century. Tenochtitlan was built on an island in a saltwater lake in the Valley of Mexico, connected to the mainland by bridges and causeways which could be pulled away to defend the city. So not only was it an enormous urban center, it was built around a natural island through landfill to support this urban environment by the Aztec and other people. Canals and aqueducts throughout allowed foot or canoe traffic and brought fresh spring water into the city while removing brackish water, because of course the lake itself was salt water. Mixed aqua and agriculture areas were built on the water, allowing this city to supply all of its own food needs for all of the residents, and streets were wide enough for 10 horses. There were up to 1,000 people in Tenochtitlan who were in charge of clearing and cleaning the streets daily, including Indigenous folks whose specific job was to collect human waste to be used for natural fertilizer in the floating gardens. And they also collected garbage, which was burned in bonfires at night to illuminate the city streets. Pretty cool if you work in waste management. Although I don't know that we want to be burning our garbage for bonfires, but still, this is, again, just meant to give some inspiration, stories you maybe haven't heard. This city was divided into 4 symmetrical quadrants with about 20 zones, an example of an early urban grid layout. All construction in this city had to be approved by someone in charge of city planning to ensure the integrity of public spaces, literally city planners on staff. Tenochtitlan at this point was 5 times the size of London. Tell me again how city planning originated in the UK. Maybe you're not someone who works in an urban environment and you're interested in more rural issues or more of the ecosystem environmental planning side. Could I see a show of hands for folks where that's more your jam? You're more into like the natural environment stuff. Great. Love the work you do. Want to share a couple examples that you might find interesting. The first one is going to be the Amazon rainforest. So again, I don't know how many folks that have heard of this example, but the Amazon rainforest was not untouched, pristine wilderness when colonizers found it, but is in fact one of, if not the largest examples of terraforming on planet Earth, and was carefully cultivated and created by the Indigenous peoples of the Amazon themselves, including by using this super cool, nutrient-rich dirt called terra preta, and specifically moving this dirt into areas around the outskirts of the Amazon to encourage it to spread and grow and become a richer environment with more food. There are also many fruit and other trees that create food throughout the Amazon that are clearly planted there by Indigenous peoples to enhance food production for their own well-being, which only contributed to the biodiversity and the richness of these ecosystems, benefiting all the wildlife and not just human life. Terra preta, the numbers really vary, but it may be found in up to 10% of the forested Amazon. So up to 10% of what is currently forested might have been cultivated. For such a huge area, that's remarkable. In the Amazon and elsewhere around the globe, studies show that Indigenous managed lands contain about 80% of the world's biodiversity. It is beneficial to all of us as we deal with declining biodiversity, species and habitat loss due to the cumulative effects of colonial land management, climate change, industrialization. It is clear that supporting Indigenous land management benefits everyone. And the lesson from the Amazon, at least one of them, is that humans can be an integral part of these ecosystems, supporting it to flourish and in turn support us. The myth that we are separate, that we only cause harm, that nature needs to be protected from human influence is an enormous fallacy, disproven by many other examples, not just this one. I have shared examples from farther afield, but I'm coming to the last couple in my presentation, and I want to move to more local examples, starting with my own people, the Kwakwaka'wakw people. Can I see hands for anyone in the room who works in architecture? Any architects in the room? I see a lone hand back there. This is mostly for you then. I hope you think it's as cool as I do. On the left here, you can see an example of a big house or longhouse. Some of our folks call them that as well. This is the kelp house from the Naxginkw peoples, and this photograph is by Hike. And I want to share this example because as we think about housing issues, land use, and how to be creative with the way we're using space to house people, I think the big house offers a lot of inspiration. These are post and beam structures which were covered by cedar planks for walls and roofs. These cedar planks could be taken from trees, and the trees would remain alive afterwards. So how amazing is that, to harvest building supplies that leave the forest intact? The planks would go around the posts, as you can see there. I mean, there's so much about big houses. I'm not going to hardly talk about any of it. But the cool thing I want to share is thinking of this as adaptive architecture. So in the winter season, when people gather together in large multifamily groups for ceremony, dozens of families could live in these big houses, or gyukzi, and hundreds, thousands of people could gather within them for special ceremonial events. So the interior could be adapted. But what's even cooler than that is in the springtime, when the weather warmed up and it was time for folks to go out into the territories to harvest, our people, the Kwakwaka'wakw people, would split into smaller nuclear family groups and go to our special harvesting areas, right? And so when that happened, what we would do is take the planks off of the poles, put them across a few canoes to make these big catamaran raft type things, pile all the family's belongings, maybe throw a baby on there, a couple kids, you know, and a family group could head off safely to a harvesting ground for seaweed or halibut or whatever, make lean-tos throughout the summer as they move throughout the territories with these planks. And then at the end of the season, when it was time to go back to the winter village, put all the planks up around the big house again. Amazing. I think there are very few examples of adaptive architecture, and this is a big need as our family sizes, as we think about aging populations and accessibility needs. Lots of inspiration there. These weren't small houses either. I mean, they're called big houses for a reason. A Coast Salish example is the Suquamish Old Man House at what is now the Port Madison Suquamish Reservation near Seattle. Is the largest big house on written record. It was 500 feet by 40 to 60 feet. And for comparison, this ballroom is about 142 feet long. So imagine a big house, 3.5 times longer and 2/3 as wide, built with the same technology, with the same adaptive possibilities. It's amazing. The scale is far beyond, I think, what any of us have been led to believe if you're a student of this. The other thing I want to talk about here, a lesson learned from Kwakwaka'wakw planning, is ethic of care as an urban design principle. The village on the right-hand side, which Taylor in the crowd is so familiar with this example, this was a Naxginkw village built in the 1800s in Blunden Harbor. And I researched elders about this village for my own thesis from VIU. Shout out to the MCP program. Pam's in the crowd. And I asked elders, can you tell me how we designed and built this village? Assuming that the most powerful folks would have gotten first choice of the spots or, something around power. That's a big thing for us often. And my late Uncle TK, our hereditary chief, said what they did was they looked at the community members and went, okay, this one family only has elders in their family. They have no young people. They need a lot of help. So let's put them right at the middle of the village so everyone has to walk past their house every day and check in on them. And this other family, all these folks are short in stature. It's really tough for them to carry all their stuff to and from their canoes all the time. So let's put them right next to the best canoe spot so that they have the shortest distance to travel when they're carrying their stuff back and forth. All the big families, powerful folks can go to the outskirts because they're good, right? They're taken care of. Let's put the vulnerable folks at the center. Imagine for a moment how different our communities and urban spaces would look if we built along similar values with an ethic of care, putting the most vulnerable people, the people that need the most support, in the places of the most privilege. The equity that would arise from that immediately is amazing. Again, an amuse-bouche, a little spark of inspiration here and there. I'm over time, but Ginger said it was okay. So my last example that I want to talk about, again, is a shout out for the folks that don't work in an urban environment but are thinking more about the environment. And maybe you won't be surprised to know that I'm talking about Garry Oak Meadows, which I think more and more are coming to be called Camas Gardens, because unbeknownst to the settlers who arrived to the Salish Sea and called these oak plains and open prairies, these pristine, again, this pristine wilderness, just perfect for settlement, for colonization, not realizing that Camas Meadows, Camas Gardens, which were spread throughout the Salish Sea and beyond, were carefully managed by Indigenous peoples over maybe millennia, but at least centuries, specifically to cultivate the carbohydrate-rich camas bulbs for food source. For individual villages alone, they would have had to produce millions of camas bulbs to feed the populations that were around in, that at the time before contact. We can't even really comprehend the scale of cultivation. And doing it in a way, again, that enhanced the local ecosystems, that nourished pollinators, that nourished these other species so they worked in symbiosis while also nourishing human beings is such a striking example of the kind of stewardship ethics that we all need to be learning from as we ourselves take care of lands that are entrusted to us. Cultural burning was a key technique for Coast Salish folks in managing these camas gardens. And of course, we know that as soon as these lands were colonized, cultural burning was outlawed, Indigenous land management was outlawed. Many of these places were turned into parks where Indigenous folks were no longer allowed to cultivate, and they fell into disrepair, and the camas bulbs diminished. All of these negative spin-offs by removing the people from the landscape, removing the traditional land management practices from these lands. I had the privilege of facilitating a 3-day workshop last year on camas garden restoration with many Indigenous knowledge holders and researchers organized by the Conservation Decisions Lab. One of the researchers there had done a study of 59 conservation and land management plans from the Salish Sea that dealt specifically with camas meadows. Out of those 59 plans, how many do you think mention the restoration of Indigenous governance as a key part of restoring camas gardens? One plan out of 59. So if you do nothing else, if you're a planner, I invite you to go back and scan your own plans to see if there's any mention of the importance of Indigenous governance when it comes to land management, even if it's just specifically around camas gardens. Take a look and see if you're the 1 in 59 or the 58 in 59. Very few of us learn these stories of ingenuity, resilience, and adaptation, but they can be invaluable to all of us as we strive to make the best use of the lands and resources, not to mention navigating our own era of collapse while trying to ensure a good quality of life for ourselves and future generations. Again, Indigenous folks have been there. We have lots to teach, and it benefits all of us. I want you to come away from this keynote today understanding Indigenous peoples as incredibly knowledgeable about land use in ways that you maybe haven't thought of before, to help get us all inspired to go home, connect with Indigenous neighbors, colleagues, and learn more about Indigenous planning and land management wherever you live and work. I have a few closing calls to action. Just a little bit of spiciness here at the end. My closing points are just #landback, the importance of supporting the land back movement. Affirming and supporting Indigenous rights and title is better for everyone, and not just for the reasons that Ginger's going to talk about, which are very important as well, but because the beneficial impacts to the environment benefit all of us. And we know that when Indigenous folks are in charge, the environment and human life in turn benefits. Another key takeaway that I didn't have a ton of time to talk about is global solutions don't work in times of collapse. Our global kind of networks lose their strength as crises arise, and overreach has been the cause of many disasters in the past. And so hyper-local solutions are going to be critical as we navigate whatever is coming our way. And hyper-local solutions come from Indigenous peoples. Those solutions will see us through the changes that are coming our way, whether we want them to or not. Not to diminish any of the optimism that I think Mayor Krogh so beautifully speaks to, which can coexist with a pragmatic attitude towards collapse, right? And then my last point is just that I think we should all adopt an ethic of care and stewardship into our work. We have beautiful examples here. I'm sure many beautiful examples in your work as well. And imagine how wonderful our places and spaces would be if we put the most vulnerable folks at the center and our non-human kin and built and managed and planned accordingly. So, Gela Kisla.
I'm definitely inspired, and I bet a lot of you are thinking, I'm not the fabulous Jessie Hemphill. How can I bring Indigenous knowledge into the plans that I'm working on for my municipality or my district? And I'm here as the pragmatic voice to share with you there are steps that we can build into our land management plans, our urban plans, our forest stewardship plans to ensure that we are doing our part to bring Indigenous knowledge into it. So I am Ginger Gosnell-Myers. I'm from the Nisga'a and Kwakwaka'wakw Nations. I work primarily in urban planning, and my specialty is bringing Indigenous knowledge into the planning and design process, because when we look around our cities and our spaces, they don't reflect anyone. They're very culturally neutral. And yet, when we choose to spend our dollars to travel across the world and immerse ourselves in other cultures, what we love about those places is how culturally reflective they are. And then we come home, and they're not necessarily as representative of the land and the place that they could be. And our work is really to change that, because there is so much history in these lands that once we start digging into and understanding the wealth of information that isn't a secret, it is all there waiting to be unlocked, we can transform the places where we live into unique places that you won't find anywhere else on Earth. So I build the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 Calls to Action, into every project I work on. I don't start any initiative until we look through both documents to understand how can we bring UNDRIP and the TRC to life. Because these are road maps to counter the colonization that has taken place in these lands for far too long. And UNDRIP is a tool that wasn't necessarily meant for those of you in the audience as the primary audience. And I feel like when you pick it up and you look at UNDRIP and you wonder what its applicability to your plans could be, it seems a little foreign. It seems like there's not so much of a match there. And so I'm going to deconstruct UNDRIP in a way that you'll start to develop a lens to understand how we can get from here to integrating a lot of the Indigenous knowledge that Jessie shared with you so that we can change the places that we live today. So UNDRIP is a document that contains 46 articles. It's international in scope. It took decades to create, and it was adopted in Canada in 2021. Canada was one of the last countries to sign on to UNDRIP, but they have, and it's a tool that helps us to understand how we can integrate Indigenous knowledge into the societies that we live in. And we do have the articles for UNDRIP, but I wanted to share some information on the preamble, because the preamble is really important. It sets the context to what UNDRIP is. And it lets us know that UNDRIP recognizes that control by Indigenous peoples over developments affecting them and their lands, territories, and resources will enable them to maintain and strengthen their institutions, cultures, and traditions, and to promote their development in accordance with their aspirations and need. It's essentially what we're trying to do here today. It's also a document that recognizes that respect for Indigenous knowledge, cultures, and traditional practices contributes to sustainable and equitable development and proper management of the environment. It is the tool that we need in order to do this work well. And it also recognizes that treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements and the relationship they represent are the basis for a strengthened partnership between Indigenous peoples and states. And UNDRIP is the most comprehensive international human rights instrument to address the economic, social, cultural, political, civil, spiritual, and environmental rights of Indigenous peoples, and sets out the minimum standards necessary for the dignity, survival, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. The minimum standards. And so the province of BC is implementing their own response to how UNDRIP can be implemented through the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, DRIPA, which is their pathway to respect our rights as Indigenous peoples while introducing better accountability, transparency, and predictability on behalf of the province. And I know you're thinking, wow, I still don't get it. Like this is hard stuff. Like, how are we going to get from here to there? This is where I'm going to make you work, right? And so it's Menti time. I don't know if you all are familiar with Menti, but it means I want you to take your phones out. And I'm going to put an UNDRIP article on the screen. And I want you to think about your workplace and the organization or institution that you work for and are with. And when you're looking at the UNDRIP article, I want you to think about how could you breathe life into it based on the work that you're doing and the work plan that you have. And this is a big one. This is Article 31, Section 1, and I'll read it out. And then I'll share with you the Menti number for you to provide your response. This article says that Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, as well as the manifestations of their sciences, technologies, and cultures, including human and genetic resources, seeds, medicines, knowledge of the properties of flora and fauna, oral traditions, literatures, designs, sports and traditional games, and visual and performing arts. And they also have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property over such cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. I chose this because it's kind of a catch-all. It looks technical, but it should spark some seeds for you on how you can introduce this into the work that you do. And so you can use your camera to scan the QR code. And if that doesn't work, you can go to menti.com and enter the code 8636 6273. And I'll give you a second to pull this up. And I'm going to go to the next slide, and you'll be able to use the menti.com and the code. Nope, that's not the right one. Can we go back one? Oh, sorry. I don't want to go to the live scene yet. Yep, this is great. Yep, thank you. So again, I'll give you a moment to look at the article and think about your work plan for your organization and your institution, and tell us, how would you breathe life into this UNDRIP article? We'll give you a minute or two to deal with it. And Tara, how are we doing for time? Okay. And maybe now we can go to the live. We should start to see some responses starting to come in. It's not open for votes yet? Okay. All right, so other people aren't able to open it as well? Yeah, okay, all right, that's okay. So in another world, we would be able to open up the Menti for you, and all of your responses would start to come in, and we'd see, you know, at least 100 responses on how you could breathe life into it. One of the municipalities that I did some work for came up with these responses here for that article. They responded that they could incorporate Indigenous languages for places for activities in biodiversity. In looking at their archives, they can preserve, conserve, and make this information accessible. They can incorporate traditional place names and history into neighborhood planning. They can identify public spaces and facilities to honor and celebrate local First Nations history, culture, and language. And they can work with and incorporate First Nations stewardship practices into climate mitigation strategies. There's a lot there, and they are across the board in terms of different practices and disciplines. And I want to continue to demystify UNDRIP. And so on the right-hand side on the article, everything that is bolded in red is my lens. That is what I look at when I try to think of how I can action it. And so it's Article 24, Section 1, and it says Indigenous peoples have the right to their traditional medicines and to maintain their health practices, including the conservation of their vital medicinal plants, animals, and minerals. Indigenous individuals also have the right to access, without any discrimination, to all social and health services. And what breathing life into that UNDRIP article could look like would be the natural resource management plans, including Indigenous values and principles. And every local First Nation has a land use plan or a community comprehensive plan or a set of principles on their websites. So you can go and you can find out what are the Indigenous values and principles for the lands that you are doing your work on. You can also ensure that Indigenous communities are connected to active transportation infrastructure, such as providing sidewalks and bike lanes, because this isn't always done for those First Nations who are in direct proximity or within a town site or an urban center. And you can create opportunities for the cultivation of traditional medicines. So there are a variety of ways that we can look at UNDRIP, and Tara tomorrow is going to do a deeper dive into this with all of you. But when I do this practice with my clients, we often come up with anywhere between 75 to 400 ideas for the UNDRIP articles and TRC 94 calls to actions that I lay out in front of them. And we incorporate all of that into the neighborhood plan, the development, the urban plan, the land use plan, the resource management plan that we happen to be working on. And this gives us a ton of room to start to understand how we can incorporate Indigenous knowledge into our practices today, because we do have to start. There aren't very many of us, and so we do require the help of all of you here to ensure that we all know much more about the lands that we live, work, and play on.
Thank you both so much. Incredible teachings, incredible learning, and hopefully if we get an answer on our text soon, people will be able to fill in the responses. If you remember the article, it would be great to get that sharing back from our audience as well. Thank you both for everything that you shared tonight. So I'm just going to ask a couple quick questions, maybe just one of our panelists, and then we're going to open up for some Q&A. And I'm going to ask that people be mindful and to try and have a very specific question, drawing on the incredible knowledge and expertise that we have on our panel today, and to avoid kind of more long-winded comments. So my first question, and it's for both panelists, is you both have worked with so many different types of land professionals, whether it's planners or local governments, academics, philanthropy, provincial governments. What comes to mind when you think of sort of those really prominent institutional or other types of barriers to why we haven't achieved all of the amazing things that we've been discussing today? So what are those things that we can all kind of work collectively together on to overcome?
I'm happy to start. Oh yeah, great, and the mic's live. Thanks, Tara. I think one example that I want to share that I see a lot is almost more of an internal barrier, which is I think so many folks, so many of you in the room are so eager to do this good work with Indigenous folks if you aren't already. And one of the biggest barriers I see is the fear of getting it wrong, the fear of making a mistake and offending, you know, the kind of ego piece about I'm worried to say the name of the nation wrong. I'm worried that I'm not going to know the protocol. And so they don't take the steps of establishing the relationship or reaching out or trying. And it's so unfortunate because I think people with good intentions could be doing incredible work. Like Ginger said, there's only, you know, we need more of us to do this important stuff. So that's one challenge, is like letting that fear of getting it wrong prevent you from moving forward with this important work.
Yes, to build on that, we also have a number of internal policies that are contradictory to our efforts in recognizing the importance of Indigenous knowledge and the pursuit of reconciliation. And we need to build in mechanisms for our organizations to revise those policies that perhaps might prioritize heritage, but not Indigenous heritage, or look at the creation of new names for parks or for streets, but not Indigenous names because they're really difficult. And instead of seeing it as something that is too difficult, build in processes behind those barriers to ensure that there is learning, if that is the barrier. There's training on language, on history, or perhaps a relationship that needs to be strengthened with local First Nations or Indigenous organizations so that you have the confidence in order to proceed. But I've never let a policy stop me and the work that I'm trying to achieve from not advancing the work that we're doing. There's always a way for us to refresh these policies, and this gives us a good opportunity to look at them and create that needed change.
Thank you. Just trying to keep us relatively on schedule. I'm going to open up the floor now. I believe there's 2 mics here at the front, and I welcome anyone who has any questions of either of our panelists to make their way to the front. And if you want to address it to both of them or one of them, just let us know. And don't be shy. I gave you the warning about no long-winded comments, but that wasn't meant to scare anybody off. And if there's any update on the Mentimeter from Stephen, he can let me know. And if we've got someone coming. Thank you, sir. No?
Let the opportunity.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's there. Okay, I'll just lean closer. I couldn't let the opportunity pass. So UNDRIP is great. Before that, we had Delgamuukw, and we had 3 cases. And it was supposed to be a watershed moment for First Nations people in this country. It was supposed to define Aboriginal title not being extinguished, and it was supposed to define meaningful consultation. What's your experience since Delgamuukw, and do you actually believe meaningful consultation is taking place now? And did it take the UN doing this to make it happen?
I didn't see Delgamuukw as the watershed moment for that societal change that we needed. I think it was a celebratory moment for our people because we recognized the importance of why that recognition was needed. But I didn't see societal change happen until the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission took place.
Yeah, I'll just echo that I think really the TRC, and then it was bolstered by UNDRIP, which kind of elevated the conversation to a global level. So much change happened as a result of that. There was so much momentum. And I think the other part of your question was around whether meaningful consultation is taking place. And I think that is case by case. In some places it absolutely is. I'm thinking about some local government folks who are doing incredible work in relationship building, partnership, like not consultation, moving away from that idea that consultation is a box you check, on the way to getting to like fulfilling your legal obligations in order to do what you want as a colonial government. And I see many local governments and others actually moving into partnership, into co-management, into acknowledging the rights and title of Indigenous peoples and figuring out a way to move forward on that premise. But I don't see that happening universally, and I wish it was.
Go ahead, thank you.
Masi, thank you. Thank you for this wonderful sharing. Before Delgamuukw, I would say there was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the relationship between the Crown and the King Chief of Canada, as he was called, upon which all the treaties were made. And I struggle a little bit on this idea about implementing treaty. I've worked in Treaty 8 for 30 years, and the elders never spoke of rights. They talk about responsibilities. They also said it was never a land surrender. The lands were not ceded. There is Indigenous title and rights and knowledge and laws that apply. And so I think in terms of the reconciliation piece, and it's taken 30 years to get actions to call the cumulative impact of development in the Northeast, finally, with a Yahi decision, as something now we will have a say, a really clear say. So I think about this idea about treaty making, both the historic treaties. I worked in the Yukon on the modern treaty, very strong, clearly defined. It took a Supreme Court unanimous decision to accept that plan. So I talk about that relationship of coexistence, peaceful coexistence, of getting to a point of being able to see we're not stakeholders, we're a governing institution. And how do we actually talk about collective interests, water, security, energy, so that we're not trying to fit into models that maybe are trying to actually distract people from the core issues that are shared in common. And so I think it's a reflective thing to go back to that first foundation, which there was dependency, coexistence, and now how do we transform ourselves into a way of thinking and acting? Where do we find the common interests? And of course, the rights have to be acknowledged to get there. So just a comment, any reaction?
Thank you. And Ginger, your Menti results are up if you want to come back up and take a chance, or do you want to stay there? Whatever you're comfortable with. some great results coming in. Thank you for everyone participating.
Can I speak briefly to that last comment?
Yes, please do. Yeah.
I think I'm glad you bring up treaty. So my mom, Colleen Hemphill, has been our nation's treaty negotiator for like 20 plus years, my whole adult life. And this is a big topic of conversation in our household. And I think it's a good thing for all of us to be aware of how much the treaty process has changed in that time and the ways in which it continues to transform. Because it's not a conversation that's over, right? What is the impact of the modern treaty process in BC on Indigenous rights and title and land management in general? I think hopefully folks are aware that in the last decade, there's been this movement away from rights extinguishment to the certainty model. So treaty doesn't extinguish Aboriginal rights, it just gives certainty about how we play together as people who have a shared interest in the land. Loan forgiveness, some Me Too clauses, some of these other things are significant improvements. But at the same time, because of UNDRIP and TRC, we see growing recognition of rights and title outside of the treaty process, and I think a growing awareness that just by declaring our rights and title, there's more appetite on the part of non-Indigenous folks to accept that Indigenous rights and title exist without needing a treaty to enshrine them. So I think there's still a lot of diversity among Indigenous peoples, among First Nations communities, and different feelings about treaty engagement within or lack of engagement within the process, and it behooves everyone to stay abreast of the changes that are happening there and understand that it is so community specific, the implications of whether they're in treaty or not and what modern treaty ratification could look like. So thank you for bringing that up. It's really relevant.
Yeah, and on the Mentimeter results, I think there's almost 150 responses that came in, right? And so you've seen this sliding through it really quickly. I think what we could do is have these results shared with everybody so that you can see how broad they are. I don't have the computer in front of me, so I can't scroll through and share each one with you, but I just want to thank you for taking a step towards recognizing that you have tremendous skill and experience, and paired with the proper tool, you can as well respond to the challenge that we often provide to the folks that we work with, which is ways that we can tangibly bring Indigenous rights into the work that we do, and planning and resource management and land use management is an incredibly powerful tool that I don't think we've often seen as spaces where Indigenous knowledge belongs. And I know for myself personally, I feel like if we are not talking about it, we're not sharing this aspiration with our younger Indigenous peoples on why they should, instead of looking at law as a profession, look at planning, look at architecture, look at design, look at civil engineering, look at sustainability planning, look at all of the things that you are involved in today. And how can we create space in our own practices to create mentorship opportunities for young people, or perhaps collaborating with local First Nation to create a scholarship for a young Indigenous person from that community who is interested in land use planning or design. And so there are a ton of opportunities, and I'm so eager for the day when there's not just a couple of folks like us who can do this work, but an army, because that's what it will take. So thank you.
Okay, I think we'll move to close, seeing no more questions. And just to reflect back on our lovely MC's teaching about going farther together. And so you now have close to 200 different actions, different ideas that you can all take in your work back to your organizations to advance just one UNDRIP article. If you'd like to learn more about the other articles and UNDRIP and its history, please join me tomorrow afternoon in one of the breakout sessions. And I just wanted to close in really reflecting on what we've been, what's been shared with us this evening, and that is that we have so much to learn from the past, and people want to often put the past behind us. But these were societies that lived and thrived for thousands of years, and the teachings that they had really can be brought back to life today. But we do need the legal tools, the instruments, UNDRIP. We need commitment from people, and we need a collective willingness, which I hope we have in this conference today. I thank you all for your time and attention, and have a good evening.